Hi everyone, welcome back to Bodhi Tree Buddhism, where today we're continuing on with our classes reading Yin Shun's classic The Way to Buddhahood, 成佛之道. Now if you're joining us on Facebook, you might have noticed that the original setup for the classes, I think I had about 8 classes and then that batch kind of ran out. I should have added some more on the end, but I think after the last class is finished I couldn't. Anyway, so this is a new setup. But it's got the same name, it's got the same format. So hopefully you've found it if you're looking for it this morning to join us live, or if you're looking to join it after the live recording. So today we are on class 9, and we're just continuing on from where we were. We're already in part 2 of the text, as you will probably remember, where we're looking at this idea of, how we go about learning and studying the Dharma, known as hearing the Dharma, or listening to the Dharma. And of course, as we mentioned last time, that would also include, any form of reading or studying, or be it directly via a person, a teacher, or whether it's via some other media such as audio, visual, etc., etc. Okay, so we're going to try to do 2 verses today. So let's just jump straight on in. No point in too much chat at the start. Okay. So we're up to the second section here. Let's just scroll up and get a little reminder of where we were. So hearing the Dharma to enter the path, the benefits of hearing, how to hear the Dharma or how to listen to the Dharma, and would also include reading, of course. Now the next section here, entering the path, it's got 2 parts. It's got external conditions and internal conditions. So the external things are when we want to actually get into this practice, there are a couple of things external to ourselves that we need to make sure we've got them in place. And then the internal ones, which we'll probably be looking at next week, are things about ourselves, our own life. So let's jump on in and have a look at these external conditions. 去入正法者，应勤尽善事，正教达实性，悲悯调为说。One who wishes to enter into the true Dharma should associate with benevolent people who have realization, can teach, know reality, are compassionate, and are skillful speakers. So just the basic concept here is this idea of basically, we could say teachers. It focuses around this phrase here, 善事, which in the verses is a slightly shortened version of a Chinese expression, 善知识. They just shorten it up because they're trying to do 5 characters per line of the verses. It's pretty simple. It's a pretty standard expression, 亲近善知识. So what we've got here, 亲近善事, to approach or draw near to. Now, how are we going to translate this term 善事? Now, if we just look at the characters here, we'd say, well, 善 is kind of like wholesome or good, and a 事 is a person, but it's kind of like originally this can refer to like the literati, the learned classes who are like the governing classes of ancient and not even just ancient Chinese society, just Chinese society in general. So they would learn the classics, and they go through this training. They learn the classics about Confucianism in particular, and then they do these examinations, and then they become like civil servants and civil officials, and depending on how well they do in their exams, they get higher positions or lower positions. Now that's the Chinese character. Here though, it's in the Buddhist context, it's kind of used just to refer to, it's like a very polite way of referring to a person of sort of good standing in society, shall we say. But it is a shortened version of 善知识, which basically translates a very well-known Pali or Sanskrit term, which is Kalyana Mitra. Now you might have heard this term before if you have been involved with Buddhism, and it's often translated as the good friend or good spiritual friend, or can even be like a teacher. So Kalyana just means someone who's good, or it could be like kind of good, wholesome, healthy, skillful. Mitra is literally just a friend, but I think that somehow using this expression of good friend is kind of a bit different from the sense that we've got here. And when we actually look in the early teachings, it really mainly refers to kind of two types. The first one is what we might call teachers. So those who are within the Dharma practice, ahead of us, shall we say. They're more advanced, more well developed on the path. They are definitely Kalyana Mitra. And again, in the early scriptures, the classic, the epitome of the Kalyana Mitra is the Buddha himself. So that's a bit more than just to sort of say a wholesome person, like the Buddha, approach the Buddha. Or it could be someone else. It could be, Shariputra, Moggallana, Mahakasyapa, and then in Mahayana literature, this would also refer to like a Bodhisattva teacher. You can learn from Avalokiteshvara or Manjushri. They are also a Sanzi, Kalyana Mitra. So how to translate it here? I've gone with benevolent people. Don't really know if it's the right term. I could say, the spiritual friend, but that doesn't really translate the Chinese. So whatever term I've gone for here, the most important thing, of course, is to understand what it means here. So it's benevolent people, good people who can guide us and instruct us. I've only actually just mentioned the first type of Kalyana Mitra. So those would be like what we might call teachers. And the other type, of course, are more like, in the sense of sabrahmachari. So like co-practitioners, people of the same stage of practice as us, kind of like our peers, as it were. And it's also important to associate with those good people too. It's not just about having a good teacher, it's part of like a whole community. And so actually, when a lot of people like get involved in Dharma practice to the point where they're heavily involved with a particular community, be it a monastery or a temple or something like that, I think a lot of people, particularly beginners, go in thinking that they're going to have like all this one-on-one time with the teacher, but actually what it turns out is we actually spend far more time with our sort of co-practitioners than the teachers themselves. And so it's important that those relationships are also strong and good, because they're going to be like important part of our training. So someone who wishes to enter into the true Dharma, it's just this first line, not much is needed to interpret this here, should, Chinjin just means like approach. Here I've got associate with, because it means like approach but also be near. Chin means to be like close to or even intimate with, in the sense of like know someone really well, you're really on very close terms. And Jin also means to be close to or near to. So Chinjin, is, with respect to a teacher, is you're not just like, that person's my teacher, and you don't say anything. You get to know them, they get to know you, you spend time with that person. And unlike some other, of course, relationships, if you're just studying at a university or a high school, you kind of get to know who the teacher is. They probably get to know you somewhat less. But because practice of the Dharma is dealing with a lot of these very deep and personal issues with who we are, that relationship has to be very close. So if you're going to approach someone and get that close to them, you have to be careful, right? We're not all just like extroverts who wear our hearts on our sleeves and just like pour out your life story to any random person you meet on the street. We want to know that this person's worth approaching. Is it worth getting that close to them, both in terms of sharing who we are and also in terms of accepting their instruction and guidance? So there's a couple of qualities. These next two lines are some of the qualities that these people need to have. I've just realized I've got my headphones on and I don't need them. The first one is zeng, here on line 3, which is just who has realization. These people need to have some realization. Now, what degree of realization? This doesn't necessarily mean that they have realized supreme and perfect awakening. It doesn't have to be that. We can just look at that in terms of, if we're this far along the path and we're going this way, somebody needs to be further along the path than us, right? They don't want to be like one step ahead of us. They're like one page ahead of us in the How to Be a Good Buddhist handbook. You want a bit more like maturity than that. But at the same time, we don't necessarily need someone who's like super advanced. Now, we do have those kinds of guides. When we're reading sutras, that's what we're doing effectively. We're reading from the Buddha from his point of view. When we get instructions from these great teachers, that's also what we're doing. But it's hard, as I say, to have this kind of like close and personal relationship with those people. You can buy your plane tickets, fly to India and get up to Dharamshala and get an audience. Well, get an audience with the Dalai Lama if you're lucky, and you may claim him as your teacher. But will he have that time to really get to know you and give you this really close personal guidance? Pretty unlikely. So we need someone that's kind of like accessible to us as well. Is quite important. I'm getting a bit of an off-topic thing here. It's not off-topic. Some people like see the big famous teacher, like, I want this person to be my famous teacher, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you've also got to think of the practicalities about whether or not that person is available to provide you with kind of regular instruction that is tailored for you. So Zeng can just be, this realization can just be, they need to be further along than you and have some good realization, a good understanding of that. Okay, the second one that they need is they need to have jiao, which just means they can teach. And this is also important too. Some people can have some understanding but not really be able to teach or instruct others how to do it. Quite important. The third one is 达实性. It's like no reality. Now this is a bit more intense, right? And again, I would say that while this is an ideal situation for a teacher to have this really deep insight, the most important thing is that they have more insight than us, and considerably more insight than us, into how things work, shall we say. Line 4, we've got 2 points here. 悲悯 is basically like compassion. They can see our difficulties and they have that kind of empathy whereby they think, well, okay, I need to help this person, need to be motivated by that. Again, not everyone who has their own realization can actually have that kind of great empathy for others to appreciate where others are at. And I think I mentioned this last week, of the situation of, there's a big difference between knowing the Dharma for your own practice and knowing the Dharma to be a teacher for others. Because say I have issues A, B, C that I need to deal with, so I just learn the Dharma to the extent where I can deal with A, B and C. That's all I need to know, because the other things that concern me. But as a teacher, somebody comes along and says, well, I've got issues X, Y, Z. Now, a compassionate teacher is then going to say, oh, well, I need to understand what these problems are and work out what I need to do to help this person go through X, Y, Z, even though I myself don't really encounter those issues. But some might not. Some might just still be plugging their ABC because it worked for them. They're not really able to kind of put themselves in the position of that other person and say, ABC aren't really that important here, or not really that relevant. So that compassion and that kind of empathy is important. And last but not least, 巧为说, so skillful speakers, kind of goes along with that second point of can teach, but also, teaching and instructing people is quite an art. Even if you see someone, you understand where they're at, now you've got to try to convince them of what they need to do. And that's not that easy, right? Most of us are pretty good at giving advice, but not taking advice. And then often in relationships, it works both ways. Both sides are trying to give advice and tell the other person what to do, but not really taking the advice of the other. So, how they express themselves, how they can point out issues of what to do without, causing offense, without making people get defensive, etc., is quite an important point here. So that is our first line here. One who wishes to enter into the true Dharma, so one who wishes to engage with the Dharma. First of all, you've got to associate with good teachers and good fellow practitioners. And these people should ideally have the qualities of having some realization into the Dharma, understanding these deep Buddhist truths, and they can teach these things, and they can teach it skillfully out of compassion. So you can also take these as markers when you're going around teacher shopping, as people do. Okay, the next bit here, verse 21. Let's go through the Chinese. 观德莫观师，随顺莫违逆。佛说满放行，学子应尊敬。Observe their virtues, do not observe their faults. be compliant and do not rebel against them. The Buddha has taught that this is the whole of the spiritual life. Therefore, those in training should respect and honor them. Now, there's some good points here, but I also really want to point out that you have to be careful and not misinterpret this, because this can also be potentially misinterpreted in a way that could be very damaging for one's practice. The first thing to keep in mind is the statements here are for when one has found a proper teacher, a qualified teacher that has those requisite qualities, wisdom, compassion, and the ability to lead and teach and guide. Now, if that's the case, then try to focus on their virtues and on their good qualities, and try not to reflect upon their faults. Now, for most of us in this Dharma ending age, you're not going to find a perfect teacher. It's going to be very, very difficult. Even to find a really good teacher, not necessarily that easy. So when you find someone, try to focus on the good qualities that they have and try to learn from those good qualities. Now, at the same time, that teacher, chances are they're going to have some qualities that aren't like perfect and they're not wonderful, and you might even have some qualities which are really not very good at all. Try not to focus on those things. The more, this is kind of the way the mind works, the more you focus on something, the more your own mind takes on the qualities of that thing that you focus on. So you have to be a bit careful about that. Now, the danger, of course, is people might misinterpret this to say, well, you know, what if you're in this situation with an abusive teacher, and then you just always lauding and praising all their good qualities and kind of ignoring these abusive or dangerous characteristics. Don't do that. And the text isn't saying that we should do that. It's saying if you've got a proper teacher, a good teacher, if the teacher is abusive, then they're not qualified in the first place, right? They're not qualified to be a teacher. So this statement of observe their virtues and don't observe their faults does not apply. Okay, so I just want to emphasize that, because it could be misinterpreted in that way. And of course, abusive teachers would do that. They would probably emphasize this, you know, focus on the good things, not on the bad things, or sort of, you get all sorts of like psychological games where they want to say, you know, oh, if you're seeing bad qualities in the teacher, it's because you yourself have bad qualities. This is kind of a sort of line that gets thrown out a lot, but if people really think that, if people think, if you see bad qualities in the teacher, it shows you have bad qualities, then I'm going to ask a question. Or in general, if you see bad qualities in anyone or anything, it shows that we have bad qualities. Question: why is it that we see in Buddhist scripture that the Buddha himself often points out faults with other people? Does that mean the Buddha had those faults? No, it doesn't. Now, I've got my own little kind of take on this. Let's go into it. I'll share my own little take on this with a kind of a bit of an element kind of from modern psychology of how to understand the situation here. So when people argue that, you know, when you're seeing bad qualities in others, it's just from ourselves and it's like a psychological projection. So let's think about this notion of projection. This can definitely happen. I'm not saying this doesn't happen. It can definitely happen that we do, by and large, project out various qualities, negative qualities in ourselves that the ego isn't willing to look at and admit. We will quickly project them out onto other people. And that's why you often see, I mean, examples of this are just so common, right? People blaming people for other things, and they're like so hypocritical, they do exactly the same things themselves. You see it like so many levels. Now, does that mean then that anyone who finds a fault with others is doing psychological projection? No. Now, the psychological projection comes from, like, in Buddhist terms, like mental afflictions, particularly a strong ego. But there's also this possibility that there could be people with no ego, so liberated people, or with a very kind of, their ego is like very weak, shall we say. And I mean that like in a good way. They still got like a bit of a sense of self. They haven't totally freed themselves from the ego, but their ego is not some like crazy megalomaniac or narcissistic sort of monster type thing. Now, those people who who are fairly low in the afflictions will see clearly. If they see other people having faults, they can see those. And in certain circumstances, they might point them out. They don't do it all the time. Sometimes it doesn't really help anyone, but sometimes it might help. So when those people are pointing out problems, people generally free from afflictions pointing out faults in others, it could be by and large fairly accurate. But then on the other hand, you might have people with very strong afflictions, a very strong ego. When they're pointing out so-called faults in others, you don't know, is it really that the other has that fault, or is it that they're projecting their own afflictions? Right? So, conclusion is, finding a fault with another isn't always a sign that that person in turn has that same fault. It's just not that simple, and we can't make like a blanket statement. Okay, a little aside, but I think a useful aside to check out. Now, so we've got this observe their virtues and observe their faults as good practice in general, and you might end up having multiple teachers over the course of your long career as a Buddhist practitioner, and different teachers have different good qualities. Try to learn all their good qualities, and the bad qualities, no, okay, it exists, not something I want to learn from them, so I'm not going to focus on that. Now, it's a similar point here with the second line, sui shun mo wei ni. So just, when you've got a good teacher and they're giving you some guidance to do such and such and such, try to follow along. If you've got like this heavy resistance to it, well, if you're not following a teacher's instruction, well, it's hard to say that they're the teacher really, are they? And there's a bit of like a, kind of a bit of maybe adolescent sort of rebellion against authority here. And it is actually quite interesting, our attitudes towards sort of authority, and how that plays into then our practice on the path. And then attitudes to authority are often, formed when we're younger because parent figures, probably like school teachers and the like, and our relations to them form this sort of the framework for how those relationships take place. Now the text doesn't go into it here, but we've got similar ideas of why, say in Chinese Buddhism, that always, even Chinese Buddhism would still put quite a heavy emphasis on respect towards one's parents, because if we can get along well with our parents, as figures that when we're young we listen to, they guide us, they have compassion for us, they show us how to do things. Then when we're older and we turn to a Dharma teacher, it's a kind of a similar thing, right? A similar thing. So if those early relationships are strong, then the relationships later in the Dharma practice can also be strong. Now, it's not to say it has to be that way, or that necessarily all parents are like super good and perfect and we have to like always do exactly what they say. Of course, things are not that simple. But if we've got that kind of rebellious tendency that we just kind of have this knee-jerk resistance, then we need to kind of reflect about our own kind of relationship with these people. Third line, 佛说满饭行. The Buddha has taught that this is the whole of the spiritual life. This is a line that comes from the early scriptures. When I'm pretty sure it's Ananda, the Buddha's cousin / attendant, who is talking about that association with the whole community of good people, shall we say. And the Buddha saying that, and he was saying like this is half of the practice, is to associate with good people. If you put yourself in a good environment with those good people, like your job is halfway done, because you're naturally gonna, we're social animals. We naturally follow along in a similar way to the people around us. We still have to do the work ourselves, but it's a lot easier. And the Buddha says, no, this isn't half the practice, this is the whole of the practice. Now, can that be taken literally? I don't know. Or is it just figuratively? We could discuss that later. But the key thing is that the Buddha did emphasize that it's really important. It's really important. And if we can put ourselves in that situation, it really helps a lot. There's a kind of a related phrase in Chinese Buddhism, which in English would be something like, you'd be better off sleeping in a big monastery than cultivating the path in a small monastery. Now, it's not really about big monasteries versus small monasteries, But it's to say that like it's more like a good monastery where everything works well and you've got everything in place. Even if you're pretty lazy, you'll kind of keep up with the flow, and that whole environment will just constantly keep you in Dharma practice mode. You just can't help it because that whole environment is in that mode of practice. Whereas in like a little tiny monastery, you can't create that big environment around you. The outside world kind of impinges closer upon you. You have to put in a whole lot more effort just to try to keep the basics going. I mean, and you could kind of compare this to sort of saying, if you just go and spend like a week at the monastery and you don't really try to do too much, you just do the daily things. Just go along, do the basic things that you do in the monastery every day. You'll find that your practice kind of advances faster than if you stay at home and try to work really, really hard, but you're still caught up in all these other things that go around you, right? All the other worldly things and distractions. So it's kind of interesting. Now, since I'm plugging like monastic life here, I'll certainly say that as well, and it's a bit unfortunate in the West. There's very few places, very few like full-time Buddhist practice environments. It's not to say there aren't any, there are, but there's not that many. And for those that really want to have a good taste, try to do this sometime, even if it's just for a weekend or a week or a month. You'll find that your practice just advances so much faster when you're in that full environment, surrounded by these 善知识, you're surrounded by these good teachers, good co-practitioners. Last line, 学者应尊敬, therefore those in training should respect and honor them. Right, so because of these qualities of these good teachers and good spiritual advisors, and the effect that they have upon us is so strong, have respect for them. I think to me it's just something that kind of comes naturally when you see someone who's got that really solid practice and those good qualities that it brings out in people, insight, compassion, all those things. To me, I feel this kind of like natural respect for those people. It's not this kind of like authoritarian respect, like military saluting type respect. It really kind of comes from the heart. It's not a respect out of fear. It's a respect out of like a great deal of affection and admiration, and also this idea that we too can develop these same qualities as well. So there we go, a couple of verses for today. For entering the path, listen to the Dharma. We've been looking at external conditions, in particular our relationship with the teacher and also co-practitioners, because they all kind of really come together under the sense of the people that we are practicing and studying the Dharma with, various qualities that they should have. We can keep an eye out for them, and if we find people that do have those qualities, these are the attitudes that we can have towards them. Basically, one of respect. Focus on those good qualities, learn what you can. If there are things that are not ideal, just set those aside. Don't focus too much on them. Some other point, we'll have the opportunity to find other teachers that will also have good qualities in those areas that might be lacking in another teacher. Okay, well, let's wrap it up here for today. That's almost our half an hour. Thanks for joining us, and hope to see you again next week. Bye.